A black man in civilian clothes stood zip-tied to a metal pole outside Precinct 9 one ordinary afternoon. Left there like a joke. Cars passed by. Pedestrians stared. 3 officers stood nearby, laughing so hard that one of them had to wipe tears from his face. A cell phone recorded everything. What none of those officers knew, what would destroy their careers, their reputations, and in one case their marriage, was that the man tied to that pole was carrying a letter in his jacket pocket. A letter signed by the mayor of Carlisle, Tennessee, appointing him chief of police effective that very morning. The city of Carlisle, Tennessee, had not had a black police chief in its 140-year history. That fact alone made the appointment of Kendrick Ellis headline news when Mayor Harlan Voss announced it one bright morning. The press conference was polished, the talking points rehearsed, and the handshake photographs were taken from 14 different angles. Voss, a square-jawed man with silver hair and the kind of permanent tan that comes from too many golf weekends, smiled broadly beside Ellis and told every camera in the room that this was a new chapter for Carlisle. Kendrick Ellis was 44 years old. He had spent 22 years in law enforcement, first as a beat cop in Memphis, then as a detective in Nashville, then as deputy chief of a mid-sized department in Knoxville that had, under his leadership, reduced violent crime by 31% in 4 years. He had a master's degree in criminology from Vanderbilt. He had 2 daughters, a son, a mortgage, a golden retriever named Scout, and the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man who had been underestimated his entire professional life and had learned to treat that as an advantage. He was also, at 6 feet and 210 pounds, a physically imposing man, but on the morning of his first official day, he was not wearing his uniform. He was not wearing a badge. He had decided deliberately and thoughtfully to spend that first official day driving through the city before reporting to the precinct to see Carlisle the way its residents saw it, without the armor of rank. He wore dark jeans, a navy pullover, and white sneakers. He carried his wallet, his phone, and a sealed envelope from the mayor's office containing his official letter of appointment, which he had been meaning to drop at the precinct for the administrative staff. He had not yet been formally introduced to the officers of Precinct 9. That introduction was scheduled for the following morning at a department-wide assembly. None of that mattered that afternoon. What mattered was that his car, a silver Ford Explorer with out-of-town plates, was parked in front of a corner store on Delmare Street, half a block from Precinct 9, and 2 officers on routine patrol thought that was suspicious enough to investigate. Officer Vance Hargrove had been with the Carlisle Police Department for 11 years. He was 36, stocky, with a jaw like a cinder block and eyes the color of old nickels. He had received 3 formal complaints in his career, 2 for excessive force, 1 for a racial slur caught on body cam, and had survived all 3 with nothing more permanent than a note in his file and a week of mandatory sensitivity training that he had loudly, publicly mocked at the bar afterward. His partner that day was Officer Bryce Kowalski, 29, who had been on the force for 4 years and had in that time attached himself to Hargrove like a remora to a shark. Bryce was not a cruel man by nature. He was something perhaps more dangerous, a man without strong enough convictions to push back against cruelty when it was standing right next to him wearing a badge. The third officer was Seth Harlan, 32, who was technically off-duty and had stopped by the patrol car to talk. Seth had a reputation around the precinct for what his colleagues generously called pranks, handcuffing rookie officers to their chairs, leaving fake disciplinary notices in lockers, once releasing a live possum into the break room. He was the kind of man who mistook cruelty for comedy and had never once in his adult life been made to feel the cost of the difference. When they spotted Kendrick Ellis walking back toward his Explorer from the corner store, a water bottle in one hand and his phone in the other, Vance Hargrove slowed the cruiser. "Who's that?" he said. Bryce looked. "Don't know him." "Out-of-state plates on that Explorer." "Could be anybody," Bryce said, though his voice already carried the flattened tone of a man preemptively agreeing. Vance pulled over. What happened next was reconstructed later from 3 sources: Kendrick Ellis's own account, the body camera footage from Bryce Kowalski's unit. Vance's had been malfunctioning for 6 weeks, a fact that would later become a separate investigation entirely, and a 17-second video recorded by a woman named Rosa Delgado, 23, who was sitting on the front steps of her grandmother's house across the street and had the presence of mind to hit record before she even fully understood what she was seeing. Vance got out of the cruiser first. He approached Ellis with his thumbs in his belt, the particular swagger of a man who has decided the outcome of an encounter before it begins. "Hey, this your vehicle?" Kendrick turned calmly. "Yes, sir." "You live around here?" "No, I'm visiting the area." He kept his voice level. He had been having this kind of conversation since he was 17 years old, and he had learned through painful and repeated experience that calm was both armor and strategy. "Visiting who?" "I have business at the precinct." That answer should have ended it. It didn't. Vance asked for ID. Kendrick provided his Tennessee driver's license. Vance looked at it, handed it to Bryce without a word, and Bryce ran it through the system. It came back clean. Of course it came back clean. It had never not come back clean, but by then Seth Harlan had wandered over. And Seth Harlan, who was bored and off duty and had already had 2 beers at lunch, looked at Kendrick Ellis standing on the sidewalk in his jeans and sneakers, looked at Vance and grinned. "What's he doing hanging around the precinct?" Seth said, as if Kendrick were not standing 3 feet away. "That's what we're figuring out," Vance replied in the same third-person erasure. Kendrick said quietly, "I'm right here. You can ask me directly." That was the moment the temperature changed. What followed happened quickly. The official account, the one the department initially tried to file, described it as a precautionary restraint during an investigative stop. The body cam footage told a different story. Vance grabbed Ellis's arm. There was a brief, sharp argument. Kendrick did not resist. He was meticulous about not resisting because he knew what happened to black men who resisted even slightly, but he also did not shrink. And that stillness, that refusal to become small, seemed to infuriate Vance in a way that resistance might not have. Seth produced a set of zip ties from his off-duty cargo pants, a detail that would later prompt the question of why an off-duty officer was carrying zip ties at all, a question that opened a door nobody wanted opened. They walked Kendrick Ellis to the metal signpost outside Precinct 9, the one that read Carlisle Police Department, and zip-tied his wrists around it. And then they laughed. Seth took a photo on his personal phone. Bryce looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Vance crouched down to Kendrick's eye level and said in a voice too low for the body cam to pick up clearly, but not low enough to escape Rosa Delgado's phone across the street, "Welcome to Carlisle." Kendrick Ellis looked back at him with an expression that Rosa Delgado would later describe to every reporter who interviewed her as the face of a man who knew something you didn't. She was right. Kendrick Ellis did not tell them who he was right away. Later, people would ask him why in interviews, in opinion pieces that debated his choice from every conceivable angle, at the town hall that Mayor Voss convened in the gymnasium of Carlisle High School, weeks after the incident. His answer was always the same, delivered with the same quiet precision. "Because it shouldn't have mattered," he said. "If I had been a plumber from Knoxville, what they did would have been just as wrong. I needed them to understand that. I needed everyone to understand that." So he stood zip-tied to the pole for 22 minutes. During those 22 minutes, 3 things happened. First, a small crowd gathered. Carlisle was not a large city, 67,000 people, the kind of place where something happening on one street was known on the next street. Within minutes, people stopped. Some took photos. A few spoke to the officers, asking what was going on, and were told to move along. Most moved along. Second, Rosa Delgado's video hit social media. She posted it with the caption, "Carlisle PD just zip-tied a black man to their own sign for no reason while they laughed about it. This is not okay. Someone needs to see this." It spread rapidly. By the time the local news station sent a reporter to Delmare Street, it had passed 2 million views and was climbing. Third, and this is where the story pivots on its axis, Captain Victor Langford of Precinct 9 received a phone call from the mayor's office. The mayor's chief of staff, a sharp, efficient woman named Carla Brennan, had seen the video. She had recognized the corner of Delmare and 5th. She had recognized the man tied to the pole. "Victor," Carla Brennan said, and her voice was the particular tone of someone managing a catastrophe in real time. "Please tell me your officers did not just zip-tie the new chief of police to your front sign." Victor Langford was 61 years old, 3 years from retirement, and had survived 28 years in law enforcement through a combination of competence, adaptability, and an almost supernatural ability to sense which way the wind was blowing. The wind at that moment was a hurricane. He ran outside. Kendrick Ellis was still standing at the pole when Victor Langford came through the front door of Precinct 9 at a pace that was almost but not quite a run. Vance Hargrove and Seth Harlan were still nearby. Bryce Kowalski had retreated to the cruiser where he was sitting with the window up and the expression of a man who had just watched himself make the worst decision of his life and was now waiting for the consequences to arrive. Victor Langford looked at Kendrick Ellis. Kendrick Ellis looked at Victor Langford. "Captain Langford," Kendrick said pleasantly, "I was wondering when someone would come out." Langford's face went through 5 distinct phases in approximately 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, horror, calculation, and then a studied blankness that was the professional mask of a man trying very hard not to visibly panic. "Get him down," Langford said to nobody in particular. His voice came out smaller than he intended. Vance Hargrove, who had not yet understood what was happening, said, "Cap, we were just—" "Get him down." Langford did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Bryce Kowalski cut the zip ties. Kendrick Ellis rolled his wrists, which were slightly red but uninjured, and reached into his jacket pocket. He produced the sealed envelope from the mayor's office and held it out to Victor Langford. "I was actually coming to drop this off," he said. "Administrative staff were expecting it." Langford took the envelope. His hands, Kendrick would later note, were not entirely steady. Inside was the letter of appointment. Chief Kendrick Ellis, effective that morning. Langford read it. He looked up at Kendrick. He looked at Vance Hargrove, who had finally visibly understood. Vance's face had gone the color of old paper. "Chief Ellis," Langford said, and the word chief landed in the air between all of them like a stone dropped into still water. "I am deeply, deeply sorry." Kendrick nodded once. "I know you are, Captain," he said. "We'll talk tomorrow at the assembly." He looked briefly at Vance Hargrove, then at Seth Harlan, then at Bryce Kowalski, still sitting in the cruiser. His gaze was not angry. It was something more unsettling than anger. It was patient. He walked to his Silver Explorer, got in, and drove away. By evening that day, the video had 40 million views. By late night, CNN had a segment. By even later, Fox News had a segment. By midnight, every major network had a segment, and the segments were saying different things about the same video, but all of them were saying it loudly. And Carlisle, Tennessee, a city that most Americans could not have located on a map 24 hours earlier, was suddenly the only place anyone was talking about. In a house on Burwood Lane, Vance Hargrove sat at his kitchen table with his wife Lila. Across from him, Lila had seen the video, Lila had seen the news. Lila was not speaking, which was, in Vance's experience, far worse than if she had been shouting. "I didn't know who he was," Vance said for the 3rd time. "That's not the point," Lila said for the 3rd time. Her voice was very quiet. "We thought he was what?" "What did you think he was, Vance?" She looked at him with an expression he didn't recognize, which frightened him because he had known her for 14 years and thought he had cataloged every expression she was capable of. This one was new. It looked like the moment someone decides something. "What exactly did you think a black man standing on a public sidewalk with a water bottle was?" Vance didn't answer. "What did you say to him when you crouched down? I could see your mouth moving on that video." "Nothing," Vance said. "You said something." "It was nothing." "Vance." Her voice broke slightly on the single syllable and then reassembled itself. "I have 2 sons, your sons, who are going to grow up and be black men standing on sidewalks, and I need you to tell me right now what you said." The silence that followed lasted a long time. Lila Hargrove took her car keys from the counter and left. She did not come back that night. She would weeks later file for divorce. In an apartment across town, Seth Harlan was on his phone with his union rep, Garrett Falk, who was explaining in a careful, measured voice that the zip ties were going to be the central problem, and the photograph on Seth's personal phone was going to be the second central problem. And the fact that Seth was off duty was going to be the third central problem, and that Garrett was going to need Seth to stop talking to anyone at all, until they had met in person. Seth agreed. Then he called his brother, then his mother, then his college roommate. By the time Garrett Falk found out, Seth had told the story to 7 people, and every version was slightly different, and 2 of those 7 people had told other people, and 1 of them had told a journalist. In the precinct parking lot, Bryce Kowalski sat in his personal car for an hour and 15 minutes without starting the engine. He was 29 years old. He had a baby daughter named Harper, 4 months old, who was home with his wife, Elise. He had wanted to be a police officer since he was 9. He had wanted to do good. He could not, sitting in that parking lot, account for the distance between who he had wanted to be and what he had done, or rather what he had failed to do, which felt worse than the doing. He called Elise. "I need to tell you something," he said. She listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Are you okay?" she asked. "No," he said. "Come home," she said. "Come home and we'll figure it out." He drove home. That phone call, that choice to be honest with his wife in the immediate hours after the incident, would turn out to be the beginning of the only decision Bryce Kowalski made in the entire affair that he would not later regret. And in a hotel room on the east side of Carlisle, a hotel he had checked into that morning before his drive through the city, Kendrick Ellis sat on the edge of the bed and watched the news on the television mounted to the wall. He watched himself on the screen. The Rosa Delgado footage played again and again, and he felt something complicated. Not exactly anger, not triumph, something more like grief. The particular grief of a man who has been proven right about something he desperately wished he had been wrong about. He called his wife, Elena, who was still in Knoxville with their children, waiting to move to Carlisle the following weekend. "I saw," she said immediately when she picked up. "I know," he said. "Are you hurt?" "No." Elena's voice carried everything that the word alone couldn't. Their entire history, every conversation they had ever had about this specific category of danger, every time he had left for work and she had let him go without saying what she was thinking because saying it made it more real. "I'm okay," he said. "I promise." "What are you going to do?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the screen. "My job," he said. The next morning at the department-wide assembly, the room at Precinct 9 held 140 officers, and every one of them was there. The room was the particular kind of quiet that is not actually silence but the collective holding of breath. Captain Victor Langford stood to one side. Mayor Harlan Voss was in the front row, which was unusual enough to signal to everyone present that this was not a routine introduction. Carla Brennan stood behind the mayor with a face like a closed door. 2 representatives from the police commission sat along the wall. A department attorney was in the back, and at the front of the room at the podium stood Kendrick Ellis. He was in uniform, the uniform of the Chief of Police of Carlisle, Tennessee, stars on the collar, the Carlisle PD badge on the chest. He had been up since early morning putting it on, and he had stood in front of the hotel mirror for a while, and then he had put it on. He let the silence run for a moment after Victor introduced him. He looked at the room. He found Vance Hargrove in the crowd, 3rd row, far left, in a collared shirt, because he had been pulled from duty pending investigation. He found Seth Harlan, who was not present because he was home under the instruction of his union rep. He found Bryce Kowalski, who was in the room in uniform and who met his gaze directly and did not look away. Kendrick appreciated that. Not the action, the looking, the willingness to be seen in the aftermath. "Yesterday," Kendrick began, and his voice was even, measured, and carried to every corner of the room without effort. "I was restrained without cause by 3 members of this department and secured to a pole outside your building. Nobody moved. I want to be direct with you about something. I am not standing here this morning as a victim. I have been a police officer for 22 years, and I have known in that time that a moment like yesterday was not a question of if. It was a question of when and what I would do when it came." He paused. "This is what I'm going to do." He spoke for 31 minutes. The speech was later published in full by the Carlisle Gazette, then reprinted by the Washington Post, then read aloud by 2 different senators in 2 different contexts for 2 entirely different reasons. It addressed accountability. It addressed systemic failure. It addressed the difference between an incident and a culture, and the work required to know which one you were looking at. It was not a speech about punishment. It was a speech about the department he intended to build, and what it would cost everyone in the room, including himself, to build it. When he finished, the room was quiet again. Then Captain Victor Langford, 61 years old and 3 years from retirement, stood up and began to clap. It was slow at first. A few officers joined, then more. By the time the applause was full, it was not unanimous. Vance Hargrove's hands were in his lap, and 3 other officers Kendrick made note of were similarly still, but it was substantial, and it was real, and Kendrick Ellis received it without smiling, because this was not a moment for smiling. This was a moment for beginning, but the applause was the last easy thing that happened for a very long time. The internal affairs investigation into the incident began the same day as the assembly, and was from the start unlike any investigation the Carlisle Police Department had previously conducted. Not because the oversight was external, though the State Attorney General's office did eventually send a monitor, but because the new chief of police was himself the victim of the incident under review, a situation for which departmental policy had no established protocol. Kendrick Ellis recused himself from the disciplinary process. He made that decision without being asked and announced it publicly before anyone could demand it, which closed the door on an entire class of criticism before it could be opened. He appointed a 3-person review board that included Captain Langford, Commissioner Alice Brandt, and Dr. Leonard Webb, a criminologist from Tennessee State who specialized in police accountability. He then stepped back and let them work. What they found was worse than the video. Vance Hargrove's body camera had not been malfunctioning. A forensic review of the unit found that it had been manually deactivated, a violation that carried criminal implications entirely separate from the incident itself. The deactivation was logged minutes before the encounter with Ellis. Vance's explanation was that he had done it by accident. The review board did not find this credible. Seth Harlan's personal phone contained the photograph of Kendrick Ellis at the pole, but it also contained a text thread from that same afternoon. The thread was between Seth and a group of 5 other officers, a group they had named with the creative poverty of men who thought they were being funny. The Yard. The texts included commentary about the encounter with Ellis, including 2 that were, without any interpretation required, explicitly racial in their language. The Yard text thread became the second investigation. Of the 5 other officers in the thread, 2 had been with the department for over a decade. 1 had commendations. 1 had been nominated the previous year for an Officer of the Year award, which he had not won, but whose nomination now read in light of his texts as a kind of institutional indictment. The investigation into the Yard's communications eventually expanded to include a review of cases each officer had been involved in over the prior 3 years. Use of force incidents, arrests in predominantly black neighborhoods, complaint records. The results of that review were released in a 200-page report months after the incident. The report was called the Langford Webb Assessment, and it documented a pattern, not a conspiracy. It was specific about that, but a pattern, a culture in which certain behaviors were tolerated, certain complaints were misdirected, and certain officers had accumulated a record that laid out sequentially should have prompted intervention years earlier. 14 officers resigned before the report was released. 6 were terminated. 3 faced criminal charges. Vance Hargrove for the body camera deactivation. Seth Harlan for 2 charges of falsifying arrest records in unrelated cases that the expanded review had surfaced. And a 3rd officer, Dale Pruitt, who had been the most senior member of the Yard group and whose case was the most severe, involving what the state attorney described as a pattern of racially motivated conduct spanning 8 years. Dale Pruitt had been given the Officer of the Year nomination. Vance Hargrove lost his badge, his pension, and weeks before the criminal charges were filed, his wife, Lila Hargrove, took their 2 sons to her mother's house in Chattanooga and did not return. Vance spent a night in a cell that was, by every account, indistinguishable from the kind of cell he had put other men in for far less. He later told a journalist in an interview that he perhaps should not have given that the night in custody had been the worst experience of his life. The journalist, a woman named Priya Denton, who had covered criminal justice for 11 years and had the patience of someone who had interviewed many men who did not understand the size of what they had done, wrote down what he said and published it without comment. The readers commented for him. Seth Harlan was convicted on one of the 2 falsifying charges. The second was dropped as part of a plea agreement and received 18 months of probation, a fine, and a permanent bar from law enforcement work in the state of Tennessee. The photograph on his phone of Kendrick Ellis at the poll was entered into evidence and later became the central image of a civil rights exhibition at the Carlisle Public Library, displayed alongside a description of the case and its outcome. Seth had to drive past the library on his way to his new job at a logistics company in Murfreesboro. Bryce Kowalski was a more complex case. He had not initiated the encounter, he had not applied the zip ties, he had not taken the photo, and he was not in the yard text group, but he had been present. He had run Ellis's ID, a fact the review board noted carefully because running an ID is a choice, and the choice to run the ID of a man who had given no reasonable cause for suspicion was itself a part of the machinery of the encounter. He had also, within 48 hours of the incident, submitted a voluntary statement to Internal Affairs that was more detailed, more honest, and more damning to his own role than anything that had been compelled from the other officers involved. He had done this without being asked, without being told to, without, as far as anyone could determine, any expectation that it would protect him, because, as he told the review board when asked why, it was just true. And I thought the truth mattered more than whether it helped me. The review board suspended Bryce Kowalski for 60 days without pay, required him to complete 6 months of additional training, and placed him on a 2-year probationary watch. It was the lightest consequence of anyone involved. Kendrick Ellis, when he was asked by a journalist whether he thought Bryce's treatment had been appropriate, paused for a long time before answering. "I think accountability should be proportional," he said finally. "And I think honesty, when it costs you something, should be recognized, not rewarded. Recognized. There's a difference." The thing about a city is that it doesn't stop while its institutions are being rebuilt. Life continued in Carlisle. Children went to school. Restaurants opened. The Carlisle Mudcats, the city's minor league baseball team, played home games that spring, and the stadium was full most nights. But something had shifted. The shift was subtle in the way that all real shifts are subtle. Not a single dramatic moment, but 1,000 small adjustments in behavior, in language, in the way people held themselves in their interactions with the department. Kendrick Ellis held his first community town hall in the gymnasium of Carlisle High. Hundreds of people showed up, a number that meant in a city of 67,000 that the meeting had filtered through networks and conversations and personal urgency, and that people had decided to come. He sat at a folding table with no podium and fielded questions for 2.5 hours without notes. A woman named Barbara Ellis, 67, who had lived in the Delmare Street neighborhood for 40 years, asked him why she should believe anything would actually change. Kendrick thought about the question for a moment. "You shouldn't just believe it," he said. "You should watch. And if what you watch doesn't match what I'm telling you, I want you back in this room telling me so." Barbara Ellis nodded slowly. She came to every subsequent community town hall. She eventually joined the new Civilian Oversight Committee that Kendrick established that fall. The Oversight Committee, 5 civilians rotating annually with real authority to review complaint files and disciplinary outcomes, was one of 12 structural changes Kendrick implemented in his first year. The others ranged from mandatory body camera audits to revised use of force reporting requirements to a new community liaison program that placed officers in non-enforcement roles in each of the city's 12 neighborhoods for a minimum of 5 hours per week. He also required, quietly and with the full backing of Mayor Voss, that all officers undergo an implicit bias assessment, not as a punishment and not as a public spectacle, but as baseline professional data, the same way a department might assess an officer's physical fitness or firearms proficiency. The assessments were conducted by Dr. Leonard Webb's research team at Tennessee State and were confidential between the officer and the department. 43 officers declined the assessment and resigned. Kendrick let them go without comment. Captain Victor Langford did not resign. He stayed for his remaining 3 years, and he became, in ways that surprised him, one of Kendrick's more reliable allies. Victor was not a man who changed easily. 61 years of pattern don't dissolve overnight, but he was a man who was capable, when he looked at a thing clearly enough, of being ashamed of it. And he had looked at what his precinct had allowed to happen for years, had looked at it with the clarity that only catastrophic exposure can provide, and he was genuinely ashamed. He turned that shame into work, which was the only thing a man in his position could honestly do. He retired the following spring with a small ceremony in the break room and a card signed by every officer in the precinct. Kendrick attended. He shook Victor's hand and said something that nobody else in the room heard. Victor nodded once. Whatever it was, it seemed to be the right thing. Rosa Delgado was 23 years old, and she had been sitting on her grandmother's front steps because her grandmother, Dorothy Delgado, 78, needed someone with her in the afternoons while she recovered from hip surgery, and Rosa had taken time off from her job at the pharmacy on Central to stay with her. Rosa had not set out to change anything. She had seen something wrong and pointed her phone at it, the same reflex that 23-year-olds in the digital age carry in their fingers without thinking. She had not anticipated what would follow: the interview requests, the profile in the Atlantic, the invitation to speak at a panel at Vanderbilt, the lawsuit deposition, not her lawsuit. She was a witness. The strange and disorienting experience of becoming a symbol for something that had happened in front of her in 17 seconds. She handled it with a grace that most 40-year-olds could not have managed. What she said consistently to every reporter and panel moderator and podcast host who asked her what she had been thinking when she hit record was, "I was thinking that someone had to see this. That's all." She did not claim heroism. She did not monetize her footage beyond the reasonable licensing fee she negotiated through a media attorney that her uncle found. She donated a portion of that fee to the Carlisle Legal Aid Society, which provided representation to low-income residents in police misconduct cases. The rest, she said in an interview with the Carlisle Gazette, went toward her grandmother's post-surgical care costs. Dorothy Delgado, for her part, told the Gazette that Rosa had been watching too many true crime videos and that this was what happened when young people didn't go to bed at a reasonable hour. Dorothy was the most popular person quoted in the article. The relationship between Rosa Delgado and Kendrick Ellis in the aftermath was not the dramatic, movie-ready friendship that people seemed to expect and perhaps wanted. They met once formally at the town hall when Kendrick sought her out specifically and thanked her personally for what she had done. She said that she hoped things would get better. He said he intended to make them better. They shook hands. That was it. Rosa Delgado went back to her job at the pharmacy. Kendrick Ellis went back to rebuilding a police department. Two people doing their actual work in the actual world, which is how most real stories end, and which is less satisfying than the movies, but more honest than the alternative. Mayor Harlan Voss had presented himself throughout the entire affair as a man of progressive conviction. The appointment of Kendrick Ellis had been his decision, and he had made it genuinely and with some courage. Carlisle was not a city where such an appointment was politically costless, and Voss had made it anyway, which was worth crediting. But Voss was also a politician, and in the weeks after the incident, as the story's national footprint expanded and the pressure from various constituencies intensified, he sometimes said things that were slightly different depending on the audience. To the city's black community, he spoke about systemic reform and his unwavering support for Chief Ellis. To the police union, he spoke about the complexity of law enforcement and the importance of due process. To the national press, he spoke about Carlisle as a city of courage and progress. To the business community, he spoke about stability and the city's investment climate. None of these things were individually untrue. Together, they added up to a portrait of a man who was trying to be all things to all people, which is a coherent short-term strategy and an incoherent long-term identity. Kendrick Ellis noticed. He said nothing publicly because his job was not to manage the mayor's character. His job was to run the police department, but in private conversations with Elena, with his former colleague Wendell Hayes from Knoxville, who called regularly to check in, he expressed a clear-eyed assessment of what Voss was. "He did the right thing getting me here," Kendrick told Wendell. "I'm not sure he knew he was doing the right thing, or if he was doing the strategically interesting thing, but the right thing got done." I'll take it. Voss ran for re-election the following year. His primary was more competitive than expected, challenged from his left by a city council member named Tamara Voss, whose campaign centered specifically on the gap between Voss's public positions and his political triangulations. Voss won the primary by 6 percentage points, which was significantly tighter than his previous margin. He won the general election comfortably. He and Kendrick Ellis maintained a functional professional relationship. They were not friends. They did not need to be. The anniversary of the incident arrives the way anniversaries always do, quietly, without ceremony, until the world decides to make it loud again. By early morning on the second anniversary of the incident, Kendrick Ellis's phone had already received dozens of messages, interview requests from 2 national outlets, a congratulatory text from Mayor Voss that used the word milestone twice in 3 sentences, a voice message from his former deputy chief back in Knoxville, Wendell Hayes, that simply said, "Still standing, brother. Call me when you get a minute." A long, rambling email from a criminology student at Tennessee State who wanted to write his thesis on the Carlisle transformation and needed 20 minutes of Kendrick's time, which Kendrick's assistant would later schedule as a 30-minute slot because the student sounded earnest, and earnestness deserved rounding up. Kendrick read through none of them in any depth. He set the phone face down on the breakfast table, poured himself a second cup of coffee, and watched through the kitchen window as his daughter, Jada, 16, attempted to parallel park the family's second car in the driveway for the 11th consecutive morning. She still couldn't do it cleanly. She got closer every day. He had learned in the past several months of watching her practice that there was something almost meditative about watching someone fail at a thing repeatedly and keep trying anyway. He found it one of the more encouraging things in his life. Elena came in from the back of the house with a laundry basket and set it on the counter and looked at him. They had been married for 19 years. After 19 years, certain conversations happen without words. "You okay?" she said, because some conversations still need words. "Getting there," he said. "I'll be better by noon." She nodded. She knew what these anniversary days cost him. Not in drama, not in the spectacular emotional reckoning that people who didn't know him might have expected, but in a quieter toll, a low hum of something he couldn't entirely name. He had been through enough in his career to understand that you don't always get to name what you're carrying. Sometimes you just carry it until the day gets lighter, which it usually did by noon, which was why he had said noon, and why Elena had nodded, because 19 years. The press conference was at 11. It was brief. Kendrick kept them brief by design and by personality. He stood at the podium in the Precinct 9 briefing room with the posture of a man who had long ago stopped needing a room to validate him. And he delivered a progress report with the precision of someone who had actually done the work and wasn't afraid for the numbers to speak. Crime statistics down meaningfully across every category that the department tracked. Community satisfaction survey results at their highest recorded level in the history of the survey, which went back to 1987. Officer retention up 32% from the year before the incident. Use of force incident data down 44%, with every remaining incident subject to a new mandatory review process that did not exist 2 years ago. The reporters wrote it down. Some looked surprised. Kendrick noted, as he always did, who looked surprised and who looked like they had expected this, and filed that information away the way he filed all information away. Not immediately useful, but available when needed. 2 years ago today, he said near the end, and the room shifted its weight slightly, the way rooms do when the subject changes from data to history. I stood outside this building with zip ties on my wrists. He paused, looked at the room. I want to be clear about something for the record. On the 2-year anniversary of that moment, what happened to me was not the worst thing that has ever happened to a black man in America in an encounter with police. It wasn't close. What made it notable was circumstance. What happened afterward was not inevitable. It was chosen by a lot of people who decided to do their jobs seriously. He looked down at the podium for a brief moment, then back up. I'm proud of this department. Not because it's perfect. It isn't, and I'll be the first one to tell you that every week, but because it's doing the work. That's all I ever asked. Sam Whitaker, the young reporter from the Gazette who had been covering the department for 6 months and still carried the slightly overwhelmed energy of someone who could not believe this was his actual job, raised his hand. Chief Ellis, do you forgive the officers who were involved in the incident? Kendrick looked at him, not unkindly, more the way a man looks at a question he has turned over many times in private and has reached a precise conclusion about. That's a theological question, he said. I'm a police chief. I'll leave that to people with more appropriate expertise. Mild laughter rippled through the room. He let it settle. What I will say is this. His voice shifted, not louder but denser, the way a river gets denser when it narrows. I chose not to let what happened to me define what happens here. That is not forgiveness. That is strategy. Forgiveness is personal. Strategy is professional. Every decision I have made in this building over the past 2 years has been professional. The personal stuff, the things I carry on in April morning when I'm watching my daughter try to park a car that belongs to me and my family. What belongs to this city is the work, and the work is getting done. Sam wrote all of it down. He wrote so fast his handwriting became illegible in 2 places, and he had to reconstruct the quotes later from the audio recording on his phone, which he had remembered to start barely 30 seconds into the press conference. His article ran the following morning under the headline, 2 years after the poll, Chief Ellis's Carlisle is not the same city. It was the most read story on the Gazette's website since the original incident. The comment section ran to dozens of entries before the moderator closed it. And for genuinely once, in the history of that comment section, the majority of those entries were not arguments. They were people from Carlisle describing what they had seen change. Small things, street-level things, the kind of things that never make national news, but are the actual texture of whether a city is getting better or getting worse. A woman named Cheryl Moreau from the Delmare Street neighborhood wrote, "He came to our block last fall to talk. Just talked. No agenda. Stayed 2 hours. That doesn't sound like much, but it never happened before, not once in 40 years. That comment got hundreds of likes, more than any other comment, more than the article itself. Kendrick Ellis drove home that evening to the house on Maple Grove. Jada had finally, on her 12th attempt, parked the car cleanly in the driveway. She had sent him a photo of it with 3 exclamation points. He had texted back a single thumbs up because he was a man of precise communication. His son Callan had baseball practice that weekend. His daughter Nyla was mid-argument with Jada about something involving a streaming show that Kendrick had never heard of and did not intend to investigate. Scout, the golden retriever, required dinner and expressed this requirement by sitting directly on Kendrick's left foot the moment he walked through the door. Normal life. His normal life. The one he had driven toward one morning 2 years earlier in a silver Ford Explorer, a sealed envelope in his jacket pocket, the city of Carlisle spread out in front of him like a question he had chosen to answer. He fed the dog. He helped Callan with geometry homework. He sat with Elena on the back porch after the kids were in bed, and the night was quiet enough to let it be quiet. By noon, just as he had told her, he had felt better. By evening, he felt like himself. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The metal signpost outside Precinct 9 still stands. It was repainted the following summer. Routine maintenance, nothing symbolic, though every journalist who mentioned it in a story felt obliged to mention the repainting as though it meant something. Maybe it did. Most things mean more than one thing if you're willing to stand and look at them long enough. What the incident left behind was not tidy. Real reckonings never are. Vance Hargrove, unemployed and divorced, moved to a small town in eastern Kentucky where he reportedly worked for a property management company. He gave one more interview a year after conviction in which he said he had spent a lot of time thinking about things. He did not say what conclusions he had reached, and the interviewer did not press him. Sometimes you run out of useful questions. Seth Harlan found with time a version of life that he had not expected and might not have chosen but was forced to inhabit. He stopped talking about the incident publicly. Some people who had known him said he seemed different. Others said he seemed the same. The truth was probably neither and both. Bryce Kowalski returned to the force after his suspension, completed his probationary period, and requested a transfer to the new Community Liaison Program. He spent the following 18 months in the Delmare Street neighborhood, the same neighborhood where the incident had occurred, doing the unglamorous, necessary, often awkward work of being a police officer who was trying to earn trust that had been violated long before he arrived. He ran into Rosa Delgado once in front of the corner store where Kendrick Ellis had bought his water bottle. It was a Thursday afternoon, and she was picking up a prescription for her grandmother, who had recovered well from her hip surgery and had recently taken up pickleball, which Rosa found inexplicable and Dorothy found invigorating. Bryce and Rosa looked at each other for a moment. "Officer Kowalski," she said. "Miss Delgado," he said. Neither of them said anything else. There wasn't anything else to say, and there was too much to say. And the gap between those two facts is where the work of actually living in the world takes place. Not in the grand statements, not in the press conferences, not in the viral moments and their long echoes, but in the ordinary intersections of people who share a neighborhood and a history, and the ongoing unfinished project of figuring out how to be accountable to each other. Rosa went into the store. Bryce walked back to his patrol car. Above the door of Precinct 9, the sign still read Carlisle Police Department, its paint fresh and its metal solid, indifferent to everything that had happened in front of it and everything that would happen next. The story you just heard is not a fantasy. Every element of it, the arrogance, the cruelty disguised as a prank, the video that changed everything, the reckoning that followed, mirrors documented, real-world events that have played out in departments across this country. Names were changed. The arc was not. Here is the truth. Accountability happens when people refuse to look away. Rosa Delgado hit record. That changed everything. You are watching this video right now, which means you are the kind of person who pays attention. So pay attention. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because the Vance Hargroves of the world survive in silence. And silence is something we choose. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, thoughtful, or both, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because we tell the stories that don't get told quietly enough, and leave a comment. What do you think real accountability looks like? What would you have done at that poll? Let's talk, because the conversation is where the change begins. Don't just watch.